Welcome back to The Perimeter. I'm Harper Vance, and on this channel, we share stories where military discipline meets civilian injustice. Today, we're deploying into the life of Captain Nora Vance, a West Point graduate and a logistics mastermind who knows that you never waste ammunition on a target you haven't locked. When Nora returns home to bury her father, she finds herself stripped of her birthright and branded an intruder by a stepmother armed with a forged will. But they made a fatal tactical error. They mistook her silence for surrender. How does a soldier dismantle a house of lies without firing a single shot? Let's get into the story. The air inside St. Mark's Chapel was thick, heavy with the cloying, sweet scent of lilies and the ancient dust of Ohio winters. It was a smell that usually promised peace, but today it felt like a weight pressing against my chest, making every breath a calculated effort. I stood in the very first row, my back as straight as a steel rod, the fabric of my dress blues crisp and familiar against my skin. This uniform was more than just clothes. It was my armor, the only thing keeping the jagged pieces of my heart from spilling onto the polished stone floor. To the congregation behind me, I was Captain Nora Vance, a decorated officer, a woman of discipline and strength. But inside, beneath the medals and the rank, I was just a daughter whose world had stopped turning the moment my father, Thomas, took his last breath. I stared at the casket. It was made of polished mahogany, gleaming under the soft amber light of the chandeliers. It was beautiful, expensive, and utterly wrong. My father had been a man of the earth, a builder who preferred the smell of sawdust and the grit of a hard day's work to anything gold-plated. He would have hated this ostentatious display. He would have called it a waste of good wood. But he wasn't the one who chose it. Karen had. She had spent the last week performing the role of the grieving widow with a precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so transparent. As the low, mournful notes of the organ vibrated through the pews, I felt a presence shift beside me. Then came the scent. It was Chanel No. 5, sharp and sophisticated, but here, in the sanctuary, it mixed with the lingering odor of incense to create a cocktail that made my stomach churn. Karen leaned in, her veil casting a shadow over my shoulder. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the casket, her profile a mask of tragic elegance. But when she spoke, her voice was a sliver of ice, intended only for my ears. "You are nothing but a foster pet. He took pity on Nora," she whispered. The words were so soft, so casual, that for a second I thought I had imagined them. But then she continued, her tone dripping with a venom she had spent years refining. "Don't think that uniform makes you his. It doesn't change the blood in your veins or the fact that you were an intruder in this family. He never truly loved you. He just couldn't figure out how to get rid of the obligation." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands, resting on my lap, clenched the funeral program until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. The paper crinkled under the pressure, a tiny sound that felt like a gunshot in my head. A foster pet. The man who had taught me how to drive a tractor, who had held my hand when I left for West Point, who had called me his greatest pride. She was trying to rewrite 28 years of history in 28 seconds. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn and demand how she could say such a thing in the house of God, inches away from his cooling body. But the discipline of the army took over. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply stared ahead, my jaw locked tight while the echoes of her cruelty vibrated in my skull. Before I could process the sting of her words, Karen stood up. She moved with a calculated grace, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief before stepping toward the pulpit. The murmurs of the townspeople died down. They looked at her with sympathy, the poor woman who had lost her husband too soon. She took a long, shaky breath, her hand trembling as she adjusted the microphone. It was a masterclass in manipulation. "Thomas was a man of tradition," she began, her voice projecting with a sudden, startling clarity. "He believed in legacy. He believed in protecting what we built together. And in his final days, he made it very clear how he wanted that legacy to continue. He wanted to ensure that the Vance name stayed with those who truly belonged to it." A cold dread began to settle in my gut. This wasn't a eulogy. This was a proclamation. Karen reached into the pocket of her black suit and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The congregation leaned forward, sensing the shift in tone. In his final will, Thomas left everything, the house, the company, and all his personal assets, to my son, Charles. He wanted to make sure his real family was protected. He knew that some people are meant for the world, while others are meant to carry on the home. The chapel erupted into a sea of hushed whispers. I could feel the heat of 100 gazes burning into my back. Shifting eyes, pitying looks, and the sharp stabs of judgment from people who had known me since I was a child. Karen was doing more than just taking the money and the land. She was publicly disowning me. She was using my father's own voice, or a twisted version of it, to tell the world I didn't count. I looked over at Charles. He was sitting across the aisle, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He was leaning back, a faint, smug smile playing on his lips. He didn't have the decency to look solemn. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery and was waiting for the check to clear. He caught my eye and gave a small, mocking nod. It was a silent dismissal. "You're done here, Nora. Go back to your barracks." The betrayal was a physical pain, a dull ache behind my ribs. It wasn't about the money. I had my career, my own life. It was the erasure. It was the attempt to delete me from my father's heart as if I were a mistake he had finally corrected. The inheritance hijacking was complete. She had isolated him in his final months, whispering in his ear while he was too weak to fight back, and now she was reaping the rewards in front of the entire town. The service ended shortly after. People filed out, many of them avoiding my eyes, unsure of how to talk to the daughter who had just been publicly stripped of her birthright. I stayed in my seat until the room was nearly empty. The silence of the chapel was different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. Karen walked past me on her way out, Charles trailing behind her like a loyal shadow. She stopped for a brief moment, her eyes scanning my uniform with a look of pure disdain. "You should probably head back to the base, Nora. There's really no place for you here anymore. We'll have your things packed and left at the gate by morning." She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. She thought she had won. She thought the battle was over because she held a piece of paper and a few keys. I stood up slowly, the joints in my knees protesting. I adjusted my cover, ensuring it was perfectly level. I felt the cold, hard edges of my reality, but I didn't feel broken. A soldier learns early on that you don't waste ammunition on a target you haven't locked. You wait, you observe, you gather intelligence. I looked at the casket one last time. My father was gone, but his true legacy wasn't in that mahogany box or the deeds Karen was clutching. It was in the discipline he had instilled in me, the resilience he had forged in my character. Let her talk, I thought, as I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the chapel. Let her have her moment in the sun. She thinks she has the final word because she has the forged will. But she forgot one thing. My father was a man of contingencies, and I am his daughter. I stepped out into the biting Ohio wind, the gray sky stretching out like a blank canvas. The war wasn't over, it had just moved to a new front. And for the first time in a week, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. I had a plan, and Karen had no idea what was coming. I was sitting in my cramped office at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, when the world as I knew it began to dissolve. The room smelled of industrial floor cleaner and the burnt, acidic tang of communal coffee that had been sitting in the pot for too long, a scent that usually anchored me to my reality as a logistics officer. I was staring at a screen full of inventory numbers, the green text blurring into a meaningless lattice, when the vibration of my phone on the metal desk cut through the low hum of the air conditioner. I saw her name on the display, Karen. My thumb hovered over the screen for a heartbeat. We didn't speak unless there was an emergency or a bill that needed my signature, so the sight of her name felt like a warning shot fired across my bow. When I finally answered, her voice was flat, devoid of the usual sharp edge she used to keep me in my place. There was no greeting and no warmth, just a cold, clinical delivery that felt like she was reading a line from a ledger. "Nora, you need to sit down," she said, her tone as dry as a desert wind. "Thomas had a massive heart attack this morning, and the doctors couldn't do anything for him. He is gone." In that singular moment, the 57 years of my father's life were compressed into a few hollow sentences by a woman who had spent the last decade trying to push me out of his orbit. The air left my lungs as if I had been physically struck, and the familiar walls of my office seemed to lean in, suffocating me. My father, a man who lived for the sound of a circular saw and the smell of fresh cedar, was a ghost, before I could even tell him I was coming home for the holidays. I sat there in the silence that followed, listening to the static on the line, feeling the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressing against my throat. I wanted to ask if he had been in pain, or if he had asked for me, but the words were stuck in a reservoir of shock that refused to break. When I finally managed to find my voice, it sounded like a stranger's, thin and fragile. I told her I would be on the first flight to Ohio and that I wanted to help with the arrangements, but Karen cut me off with the cold efficiency of a guillotine. "There is no need for that, Nora," she said, and I could almost hear the thin, triumphant smile on the other end of the line. "I have already taken care of everything. Your father was very clear about what he wanted, and frankly, you have been away from home for so long that you wouldn't even know where to begin. You chose your career over this family, so don't come back now trying to play the devoted daughter." The accusation hung in the air, a poisonous fog designed to make me feel like a traitor for serving my country while she systematically dismantled my place in my father's heart. The flight back to the Midwest was a blur of gray clouds and the quiet, desperate realization that I was returning to a home that was no longer mine. When I finally pulled the rental car into the driveway of our old house in Ohio, the sight of it made my stomach twist. This was the place where my father had taught me how to measure twice and cut once, where the porch always had a fine dusting of sawdust and the smell of black coffee. But Karen had been busy. The old, comfortable wooden chairs were gone, replaced by expensive white wicker furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine for people who never actually sat down. The house didn't smell like wood anymore. It smelled of cloying, expensive luxury candles that made my eyes water. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by the somber, heavy notes of classical music playing softly through the speakers, a far cry from the classic rock my father used to blast while he worked in the garage. I stood in the living room, feeling like an intruder in the very space where I had taken my first steps. Everything that spoke of my father's rugged, simple spirit had been tucked away or replaced with items that screamed of Karen's need for status. Even the mahogany casket I had seen in the chapel, gleaming with a vulgar, polished finish, was a testament to her control. It was a box built for show, not for a man who had spent his life with dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his palms. Every corner of the house was a reminder that I had been replaced, that while I was halfway across the country, Karen had been carefully redecorating my father's life until there was no room left for me. The true extent of her cruelty was revealed the following morning when I ran into Mrs. Higgins, our neighbor from across the street. She approached me with a casserole dish and a look of deep, agonizing pity that I didn't understand at first. "Oh, Nora," she whispered, taking my hands in hers. "We were all so heartbroken that you couldn't be reached during his last week in the hospital. Karen told everyone how she tried to call you day and night, but that you were on a top-secret assignment and couldn't be disturbed for personal matters. She said you told her the mission came first." I felt a sudden icy chill wash over me as I pulled my phone from my pocket with trembling fingers. I went back through my history, searching through the weeks of my father's decline. There was nothing. No missed calls, no frantic texts, no emails. Karen hadn't just shut me out of the funeral. She had built a digital firewall around my father's deathbed, telling him in his final, lonely hours that his daughter was too busy to say goodbye. As I stood there on the quiet Ohio sidewalk, I realized I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting a woman who had tried to erase my very existence from my father's memory. Watching Nora stand on that sidewalk, realizing that her own mother figure had systematically cut her off from her dying father, is a moment that breaks my heart every time I tell it. It is a specific kind of betrayal when your service and your distance are used as weapons against your heart. If you have ever felt like someone was trying to rewrite your history, or if you are rooting for Nora to find the truth, please give this a like and share your support. Just comment the word resilience, or leave a heart emoji below to let me know you are standing with her in this storm. Your engagement helps us keep sharing these stories of strength and truth. I walked toward the back of the property, my boots crunching on the gravel path that led to my father's workshop. This small, weather-beaten building had always been my sanctuary, a place where the chaotic noise of the world was replaced by the rhythmic rasp of a handplane and the honest smell of fresh-cut cedar. It was here that my father, Thomas, had taught me that a man's worth was measured by the precision of his work and the strength of his word. But as I reached the heavy oak door, the air changed. The scent of sawdust and oil, which usually felt like a warm embrace, was now choked by something chemical and cloying. The acrid, artificial smell of a cheap electronic cigarette. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, sharpening clarity. I pushed the door open, and the sight that met me felt like a physical violation of everything I held sacred. Charles was sitting in my father's old leather swivel chair, the one with the worn armrests where the leather had smoothed over 30 years of late-night drafting. He didn't look up when I entered. Instead, he kept his eyes glued to a smartphone, his thumb flicking lazily across the screen while he exhaled a plume of blue-tinted vapor into the rafters. His dirty sneakers were planted firmly on the center of the oak workbench, right where my father used to lay out his most delicate blueprints. A half-empty soda can sat nearby, leaving a sticky, dark ring on the wood that had been meticulously oiled for decades. It was the ultimate display of stolen legacy, a predatory occupation of a space he had done nothing to earn and everything to desecrate. "Welcome back, foster sister," Charles said without looking at me, his voice thick with a smug, unearned victory. His choice of words was a deliberate echo of Karen's earlier insult, a calculated attempt to remind me that in their eyes, I was an outsider in my own bloodline. He finally lowered his phone, giving me a look that was half pity and half malice. "Mom told me I could finally clean this place out. It's about time we did something useful with it. This old wood shop is a relic, Nora. It's dusty, it's drafty, and frankly, it's a waste of prime real estate. I'm thinking about ripping out these benches and putting in a full gaming suite. Top-tier fiber optics, blacked-out walls, the works. I think Dad would have liked that more than a bunch of rotting lumber." He emphasized the word dad with a sickening familiarity that made my skin crawl. This was a boy who had never spent a single hour helping my father carry a beam or sand a joint. He had spent his life dodging responsibility while my father built the very house that sheltered him. Now, he was acting like the triumphant heir, treating my father's life work like trash to be discarded for a playroom. I looked around the room, my eyes landing on the rusted toolbox in the corner, now covered in a layer of grime and neglect. Each tool in that box had a story, a lesson in discipline that had helped me survive my years in the military. To Charles, it was just heavy metal. To me, it was the foundation of my soul. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the heat of a soldier who has been pushed into a corner, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I remembered the words of George S. Patton about telling people what to do rather than how to do it. I realized then that Charles was showing me exactly what he was, a hollow man who mistook possession for power. The silence in the workshop stretched out, heavy with the weight of my father's absence and the loud, obnoxious presence of the intruder. Charles chuckled, apparently taking my silence for defeat. "Go ahead and take a look, Nora. It's the last time you'll see it like this. Tomorrow, the dumpster arrives for the scrap wood. You should probably head back to the base soon. There's really no room for you in the new Mitchell legacy." He didn't notice when I moved toward the workbench. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I was conducting a different kind of reconnaissance. As I stood near the corner of the table, my eyes caught a glimpse of something small and familiar lying on the floor, half hidden under a pile of discarded fast food wrappers Charles had left behind. It was my father's old pocket comb, a simple black plastic thing he had carried for as long as I could remember. It was stained with the sweat and sawdust of his labor, a piece of him that was too humble for Karen or Charles to even notice. I leaned down and picked it up, the plastic feeling cool and solid in my palm. I wiped away a smudge of dirt and tucked it into the pocket of my uniform, right over my heart. Charles watched me with a sneer, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Wow, really? You're reduced to picking up trash now?" That's pathetic, Nora. Even for a soldier. If you want some old junk, just ask. I'm sure there's plenty more in the bin. He laughed then, a sharp grating sound that filled the workshop. But I didn't respond. I looked him in the eye, the steady, unblinking gaze of someone who has seen the worst the world has to offer and survived. He didn't realize that in my world, information was the most valuable currency. He didn't know that the simple object in my pocket held more than just memories. It held the very essence of the man they were trying to erase. As I turned and walked out of the workshop, leaving the smell of fake fruit and arrogance behind me, I felt a new kind of resolve. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore, and I wasn't just a foster sister to a thief. I was a strategist. Karen and Charles believed they had won because they held the keys and a forged paper, but they had forgotten that a house built on lies has no foundation. I stepped out into the biting wind, the old comb pressed against my chest like a talisman. The battle for the Mitchell name had truly begun. And they had no idea that I had just secured my first piece of evidence. I sat in my rental Jeep, the engine idling quietly as I watched the warm, golden light spill from the windows of the house where I had grown up. Inside, the scene looked like a distorted version of a Hallmark movie. Karen and Charles were gathered around the large oak dining table, the very one my father had built with his own hands. They were laughing, passing around platters of slow-roasted BBQ ribs and bowls of creamy mashed potatoes, the exact meal my father used to request every Sunday afternoon. The irony was a jagged pill to swallow. I had traveled thousands of miles from Fort Bragg, carrying the weight of my grief and the exhaustion of the front lines, only to be left sitting in the dark of the driveway while they feasted on the remnants of my father's life. My stomach cramped, not just from hunger, but from the sheer cold-blooded cruelty of their exclusion. A soldier is trained to survive in the harshest environments, to endure physical deprivation and the isolation of the field. But there is no training manual for the hollow ache of being treated like a ghost in your own home. The light from the house felt like a physical barrier, a wall of warmth that I was no longer allowed to touch. I watched Karen lean back and smile at something Charles said, her silhouette framed by the expensive curtains she had used to hide the view of the woodshop. It was a calculated psychological operation, a way to signal that the territory had been fully occupied and that the previous inhabitant was no longer recognized. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale against the black leather, feeling the armor of my discipline begin to crack. But then a soft, rhythmic tapping on the passenger side window broke the silence of the cabin. I looked over to see the kind, weathered face of Ruth Martinez, my godmother, and the woman who had lived next door since before I was born. She was standing there in her heavy wool coat, holding a steaming thermos and a small box that smelled faintly of cinnamon and sugar. I rolled down the window, and the cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of real Ohio autumn. "Come on, Nora," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of my thoughts. "Stop looking into that house. It does not belong to you right now, and watching them won't bring Thomas back. Come inside where it's warm." Ruth's kitchen was the polar opposite of the sterile, luxury-obsessed environment Karen had created next door. It was small, cluttered with ceramic roosters and mismatched chairs, and it smelled heavenly. A mix of vanilla, aged paper, and simmering beef. She didn't ask me a dozen questions or demand that I talk about my feelings. Instead, she pushed a heavy ceramic bowl of beef stew toward me, the steam rising in lazy curls. "I know you haven't eaten properly since you landed," she murmured, placing a crusty piece of bread on the side. This was the Midwestern hospitality I remembered, the quiet way people looked out for one another without making a spectacle of it. As I took the first bite, the warmth of the food seemed to thaw the ice that had settled around my heart. For the first time in days, I felt seen, not as a rank or a foster daughter, but as a person who was hurting. After the meal, Ruth reached for a weathered wooden box on the counter. She set it down between us and opened the lid. "Your father sent me these over the last few years," she said, her eyes softening. Inside were dozens of postcards I had sent from various bases and deployments. Vibrant images of German cathedrals, the dusty horizons of the Middle East, and the coastal views of the Carolinas. My breath hitched. Karen had told me years ago that my father had stopped keeping them that he found the reminders of my absence too painful and had eventually thrown them away. But as I pulled one out, I realized the truth was far more beautiful and more heartbreaking. My father had not only kept them, he had meticulously laminated each one to protect the ink from fading. He knew Karen would try to get rid of them, Ruth explained, so he started bringing them over here one by one. He would sit at this table, have a cup of coffee, and read them to me. He was so proud of you, Nora. He used to say that you were the only thing in his life that was built to last. I ran my fingers over the smooth plastic covering my own handwriting, feeling a surge of gratitude that threatened to overflow. The inheritance hijacking Karen had attempted went far beyond money. She had tried to steal the evidence of my father's love, but she had failed. The truth was preserved in this small, quiet kitchen, held safe by a woman who had no biological claim to me, but possessed all the loyalty of a true mother. As the night wore on, the door opened, and Mr. Whitaker, the town's retired attorney and a longtime friend of my father, stepped in. He didn't come with a formal summons or a briefcase. He came with a firm handshake and a look of grim determination. "I heard what happened at the chapel, Nora," he said, pulling up a chair. "It was a disgrace. But you should know that Thomas was a man of contingencies. He didn't just build houses. He built foundations that could withstand a flood." Lying in the guest bed at Ruth's house that night, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, I realized that I was no longer a lone soldier retreating from a lost battle. I had found my chosen family, the people who remembered the man my father truly was and who were willing to stand with me in the light of the truth. Karen could have the mahogany casket and the wicker furniture. She could have the bank accounts and the public sympathy of the town's elite. But she didn't have the soul of the Mitchell family, and she didn't have the discipline I had spent my entire adult life perfecting. With Ruth and Whitaker by my side, I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was the architect of a counter-offensive. I closed my eyes. The image of my father's laminated postcards burned into my mind. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, I thought, remembering the words that had guided me through many long nights at the base. Only light can do that. And tomorrow, the light was going to get very, very bright for Karen. The silence in Ruth's guest room was a fragile thing, a temporary peace I had almost convinced myself was real, until the vibration of my phone on the wooden nightstand shattered it. It was 2:14 a.m. In the military, a call at this hour meant a crisis or a mobilization. In my family, it usually meant a different kind of disaster. I stared at Karen's name on the screen, the blue light washing over the ceiling in rhythmic pulses before I finally answered. Her voice came through the speaker, not with the icy calm she had shown at the funeral, but with a frantic, breathless desperation that set my teeth on edge. "Nora, you have to help us," she gasped, the sound of fake tears already audible in the background. "Charles is in trouble. He made a mistake with a real estate investment, a big one, and now these people are threatening legal action. They need $50,000 by the end of the week, or he could lose everything. You are the only one who can save him." I sat up, the cold air of the room biting at my shoulders. The audacity was staggering. Only days ago, she had stood in a chapel and told the town I was a foster pet, an intruder who deserved nothing. Now, she was reaching for my bank account with the practiced ease of a predator. She knew about my savings, the money I'd painstakingly put aside from my combat pay, and the hazard bonuses from my time in Afghanistan. She wanted to take the blood and sweat of my service and use it to bail out her son's latest failure. When I didn't immediately agree, her tone shifted with a speed that would have given me whiplash if I hadn't seen it before. The desperation hardened into something sharper, something meant to cut. "Nora, don't you dare be selfish now," she snapped, her voice dropping into a low, poisonous register. "You are a career officer with a high salary and more benefits than you know what to do with. Meanwhile, your father worked himself into an early grave on those construction sites just to keep a roof over your head. He died of exhaustion while you were sitting in a comfortable office halfway around the world. You owe him this. Helping Charles is the only way you can pay back the debt you left behind when you abandoned us." The words felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus, a calculated attempt to rewrite my entire history. She was using my father's death as a blunt instrument to beat me into submission. turning my service into a crime and his hard work into a bill she was now collecting. It was a classic display of the manipulation I had dealt with for years, a way to ensure I felt small and guilty enough to keep the checks coming. The next morning, I walked into the local diner, hoping for a quiet cup of coffee and a moment to clear the fog from my head. But the moment I stepped through the door, the atmosphere shifted. The low hum of conversation died down, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. I felt the weight of a dozen stares, none of them friendly. At the counter, I saw Mr. Henderson, an old family friend who used to play chess with my father every Saturday. Usually, he'd greet me with a wide smile and a story about the old days. Today, he wouldn't even meet my eye. I ordered a black coffee, my hand steady despite the knots in my stomach. As I waited, I heard a voice from the booth behind me, loud enough to ensure it wasn't a mistake. "Must be nice to have all that government money while your mother is struggling to pay the mortgage," a man muttered. I turned slightly and saw Joe, a guy who had worked on my father's crew for a decade. He looked at my uniform with a mixture of disappointment and disdain. "I heard you turned your back on them, Nora. I guess the military really does turn people into stones." Karen had been busy. She hadn't just called me. She had systematically poisoned the well of my own community, painting me as the heartless, wealthy officer who was letting her grieving family drown in debt. I took my coffee and walked out, the air outside feeling cleaner than the judgment inside. I sat in my Jeep, looking at the banking app on my phone. The balance was more than just a number. It represented every night I spent in a tent, every mission that kept me awake, and every sacrifice I made for a future I thought I was building with my father. Karen didn't just want the $50,000. She wanted to strip me of my security and my dignity until there was nothing left but a shell she could control. She was trying to finish what she started at the funeral, the total erasure of Nora Vance as an independent woman. But as I looked at the screen, the deep bitterness, the feeling of being choked by injustice, began to transform. The confusion and the hurt were still there, but beneath them, a cold, hard resolve was taking shape. I realized then that there would be no compromise with a woman who used my father's memory as a weapon. I didn't call her back. Instead, I turned off the phone and stared at the gray Ohio horizon. The campaign of divide and conquer she'd run for years had finally hit a wall. It couldn't break. She thought my discipline was a weakness she could exploit, a set of rules that would keep me silent while she picked my pockets. She was wrong. A soldier knows when a position is no longer defensible, and I was done trying to defend my place in a family that had been replaced by a business arrangement. If Karen wanted to treat this like a battlefield, I would stop acting like a victim and start acting like the strategist my father had raised me to be. I felt a strange sense of liberation as I pulled away from the diner. The community might think I was a villain, and Karen might think I was her personal ATM. But I knew the truth. And in the military, we have a saying: the truth is the ultimate force multiplier. I was done being pushed. It was time to push back. The community hall of St. Jude was bathed in the warm, deceptive glow of string lights and the rich, savory aroma of roasted turkey and stuffing. It was the annual Thanksgiving community dinner, an event that usually felt like the beating heart of our small town. But as I sat at a long wooden table, surrounded by neighbors who had once treated me like a daughter and now looked at me like a stranger, the air felt thin and toxic. Karen was in her element. She had spent the last hour working the room, her voice a soft, tragic melody as she accepted condolences and whispered about the heavy burden of the Mitchell legacy. I watched her from the end of the table, my hands resting flat on the white linen cloth. I could see Charles across from her, his plate piled high with food he had done nothing to earn, looking bored and entitled. The tension in my chest was a coiled spring, wound so tight it was beginning to ache. Then, the room went quiet as Karen stood up, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal water glass. The sound was sharp and intrusive, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade. "Friends," she began, her voice trembling with a practiced, fragile grace. "I want to thank you all for being here to honor my late husband, Thomas. He loved this community, and he worked every day of his life to build something that would last. But as we look toward the future, my heart is heavy. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room until they landed squarely on me. Everyone turned. I felt the collective weight of their gaze, a mixture of curiosity and the judgment Karen had so carefully cultivated. It is a tragedy when a man's only daughter, a woman who has been given so much by this town and the military, refuses to contribute a single cent to save his life's work. She dabs at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her voice rising in a mock pious sorrow. Perhaps the army teaches you how to shoot a rifle, Nora, but it clearly forgot to teach you how to be a human being or a daughter. Thomas would be so heartbroken to see your coldness today. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. I saw the faces of men who had worked on my father's crews, women who had baked me cookies when I was a girl, and even the local priest. Their expressions were etched with a deep, visceral disgust. Karen leaned back, a tiny, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth that no one else could see. She thought she had won. She thought the public shaming was the final nail in the coffin of my reputation. She expected me to shrink, to hide my face in shame, or perhaps to bolt from the room in tears. But Karen made a fatal tactical error. She mistook my silence for surrender. A surge of energy, cold and electric, raced up my spine. The years of biting my tongue, the months of isolation at the base, and the crushing weight of the lies she had told my father all converged into a singular, icy fire. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of my years in command. The heavy wooden chair screeched against the polished floor, a sound like a rallying cry that made the room fall into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. I didn't look at the neighbors. I didn't look at the priest. I kept my eyes locked on Karen, my gaze a steel blue blade that seemed to pin her to her seat. The smug mask on her face didn't just slip, it shattered. "Are you finished, Karen?" I asked, my voice calm and steady, projecting with the authority of an officer on a parade deck. The silence in the hall was so absolute I could hear the hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen. For 6 years, you have woven a web of deceit. You have spent every waking hour trying to drive a wedge between me and my father, whispering poison in his ear while he was too weak to defend himself. You stole his peace, you stole his assets, and now you are trying to steal my dignity to cover for your son's laziness. I turned my head, looking at the faces in the crowd, my voice never wavering. You talk about honor and community, yet you stand here and use my service to this country as a weapon against me. You insult the uniform I wear and the sacrifices I have made just because I refuse to fund your son's gambling and bad investments. I do not owe you a single dollar, Karen. And I certainly do not owe this room an explanation. I stepped away from the table, my boots echoing with a rhythmic, military precision that felt like a heartbeat. But I do owe my father the truth, I continued, stopping just inches from where she sat. And from this moment on, I will not be silent. I will not allow you to rewrite his life or mine to fit your greedy narrative. The war you started in that chapel is coming to your front door, and I suggest you get ready because I am not a foster pet, and I am certainly not a victim. I am a Mitchell, and I am a soldier of the United States Army. You have fired your last shot, Karen. Now, it is my turn. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the confusion starting to bloom on the faces of the townspeople as they looked from my steady, unwavering presence to Karen's pale, trembling form. Charles half rose from his seat, his mouth opening as if to say something, but I only had to cut my eyes toward him for a second before he slumped back down, his bravado evaporating. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the exit, my back straight, my head held high under the weight of my cover. I stepped out into the crisp, biting night air of Ohio, the stars overhead looking like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The adrenaline was still humming through my veins, but for the first time in a week, the suffocating weight on my chest was gone. I felt a sense of liberation so profound it almost made me lightheaded. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my phone, dialing a number I'd memorized years ago. "Whitaker," I said when the line connected, his voice answering on the first ring. "It's Nora." "Proceed to phase 2 immediately. I have the recordings, I have the evidence of the alienation, and I just gave her the warning she deserves. I want every lie she told brought into the light. The time for endurance is over." It's time for justice. There comes a moment in every battle where silence is no longer an option, where the truth must be shouted from the rooftops. Seeing Nora finally stand up to the public humiliation Karen tried to heap on her is the kind of victory we all crave when we have been pushed too far. If you felt that surge of pride for Nora, please give this a like and share your thoughts. If you have ever had to find your voice in a room full of people who did not want to hear it, comment the word justice or leave a blue heart below. Your support is what gives these stories their wings. The air inside Lawyer Whitaker's office felt different than the cloying atmosphere of the chapel or the sterile cold of my rental Jeep. Here, among the floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound law books and the faint scent of aged parchment and stale coffee, there was a sense of order and impending justice. It felt like a command center. Whitaker had cleared his large oak desk, spreading out documents in manila folders like they were topographic maps for a major offensive. He looked up as I entered, his eyes weary but sharp behind his spectacles. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pushed a white envelope toward me, his voice low and steady. "Nora, we got the expedited results from the lab in Columbus. I used the chain of custody protocols you suggested for the items you recovered." I took a breath, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first sheet. The DNA profile from the hair on the old pocket comb was an undeniable match. The probability of paternity between Thomas Mitchell and me was 99.97%. It was the confirmation I didn't think I needed, yet seeing the numbers on the page felt like a heavy stone being lifted from my soul. But then Whitaker cleared his throat and slid a second sheet across the desk. "This one is for Charles," he said. I cross-referenced it with the samples we managed to obtain from the discarded soda can you provided. The results were startling. Charles has zero biological connection to your father. He's not a Mitchell. He never was. The realization hit me like a physical wave. Karen hadn't just manipulated my father's emotions. She had built an entire dynasty on a foundation of absolute biological fiction. Charles was a perfectly crafted lie, a pawn in her long game to secure the Mitchell legacy for herself. I sat back in the chair, the paper crinkling in my hand. The betrayal was so deep it felt almost surreal. But Whitaker wasn't done. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small battered silver USB drive. "Your father's foreman, Pete Garrison, came to see me yesterday," he explained. "He said Thomas gave him this about a week before he collapsed at the construction site. He told Pete to keep it safe and only give it to me or to you if things went south." Whitaker clicked the drive into his computer, and after a moment of static, a voice filled the room. It was my father. His voice sounded thin, raspy from years of inhaling drywall dust, and heavy with an exhaustion that broke my heart. "Nora, if you're hearing this, it means the worst has happened and I'm not there to stand between you and Karen," he began. I saw the tears start to blur my vision, but I forced myself to stay focused, my hand gripping my pen so hard the plastic groaned. "I know she's been telling you I turned my back on you. I know she's been trying to make me believe you forgot about your old man. But I found the postcards, Nora. I found them hidden in her vanity. I realized then that she's been playing us both for fools. She's tried to take the company, and she's tried to take you away from me. I was too weak to fight her in the house, but I've been building something in the dark. There's another will, Nora, the real one. I've hidden it in the one place she'd never look because she never bothered to step foot in it. Look behind the false panel in the back of my drafting table, in the workshop. It's all yours, honey, every bit of it. Give her hell for me." The recording clicked off, leaving the office in a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. My father hadn't been fooled. He had been a prisoner of his own failing health and her manipulation, but he had fought back with the only tools he had left. The next evening, I met Pete Garrison and the rest of the old construction crew at a quiet warehouse on the edge of town. These were men with calloused hands and honest eyes, the kind of people who formed the backbone of the Midwest. I played the recording for them, and as my father's voice echoed through the cold, cavernous space, I saw these rugged men struggle to keep their composure. Pete, a giant of a man with silver hair and a permanent scowl, wiped a tear from his cheek with a grease-stained thumb. Thomas was like an older brother to us, Nora, he said, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and simmering rage. We knew something was wrong. We saw the way she treated him toward the end, isolating him from the job sites and the office. You tell us what you need. We'll be your eyes and ears. Karen thinks she's going to sell that company to a developer on Monday, but she's got another thing coming. We won't let her move a single piece of equipment or a single file out of that house until you give the word. I looked at the circle of determined faces and realized I was no longer a lone officer trying to hold a crumbling position. I had an army of my own, a chosen family of laborers and craftsmen who valued my father's honor as much as I did. We spent the next hour coordinating our movements, establishing a perimeter of observation around the Mitchell property to ensure no evidence was destroyed before the estate meeting. I spent the final night before the meeting in a state of hyper-focused preparation. Lawyer Whitaker had finalized the legal filings, the emergency asset freeze, the petitions for the exhumation of the will, and the formal eviction notices based on the fraud we had uncovered. I sat at Ruth's kitchen table, reviewing the timeline and the evidence one last time. I thought about the words of Theodore Roosevelt about speaking softly and carrying a big stick. I had spent years in the military learning that the most effective weapon isn't always the one that makes the loudest noise. It's the one that is the most precisely targeted. Karen was still operating under the assumption that she was in control. She was likely at the house right now, celebrating her perceived victory and planning how to spend the money from the sale of my father's life work. She had no idea that the silent, disciplined daughter she'd dismissed as a foster pet had spent the last 48 hours dismantling her entire reality. I looked at the photograph of my father I kept in my pocket, the one taken the day I graduated from West Point. He was smiling, his arm around my shoulder, looking like the proudest man on earth. That hour was nearly here. Tomorrow I wasn't going into that house with a gun or a grudge. I was going in with the truth, and in a court of law and the court of public opinion, that truth was going to be more devastating than any firepower I'd ever witnessed. I closed my eyes for a few hours of restless sleep, the plan etched into my mind. Tomorrow, I was going to bring my father home. The air inside St. Mark's Chapel was heavy with the expectation of a final resolution as the townspeople gathered for the formal distribution of the Mitchell estate. I stood at the front, my back as straight as a steel rod, feeling the weight of the medals on my uniform, but no longer the weight of the lies Karen had tried to crush me with. Karen was sitting in the front pew, wearing an outfit that suggested mourning, but eyes that flickered with greed as she waited to finalize the sale of my father's company. Lawyer Whitaker entered the room with a deliberate pace, carrying a small silver USB drive that felt heavier with truth than any legal document ever could. Karen stood up to intercept him, her voice a sharp hiss about this being a private matter and calling the presence of my father's construction crew a disgrace. I did not need to speak. I simply met her gaze with a cold, steel-blue clarity that forced her to step back, her manufactured smile finally withering under the pressure of a real officer in command. Whitaker ignored her completely and moved to the pulpit, connecting the drive to the chapel's integrated sound system. The room fell into a silence so absolute that the hum of the old heater felt like a roar. Then, my father's voice filled the sanctuary. Thomas Mitchell, sounding weary but unmistakably clear. He spoke directly to the room, apologizing to me for allowing Karen to weave a wall of static between us and exposing the systematic way she had isolated him during his final months. Every word was a tactical strike against the mahogany casket of lies Karen had built, and I felt a profound sense of release as my father finally spoke for himself through the silence of the grave. As the echoes of my father's voice faded, Whitaker did not allow the room a moment to recover. He moved directly to the forensic results, tapping a thick file that represented months of digital and biological investigation. He spoke of federal standards for genetic testing and the rigorous chain of custody we had maintained for every piece of evidence. He announced to the stunned congregation that the probability of paternity between Thomas Mitchell and Nora Bird was 99.97%. The whispers in the pews were like a rising tide as the community realized the foster pet narrative was a manufactured fraud designed to alienate a legitimate daughter from her birthright. But Whitaker saved the most devastating blow for the second sheet of paper. He declared that Charles Thompson had zero biological connection to my father. This reveal hit the room like a grenade, shattering the image of the golden heir that Karen had carefully cultivated over 6 years of marriage. The townspeople who had looked at me with disdain only days ago now turned their collective judgment toward the woman who had brought a stranger into their midst under the guise of family. Karen looked as though she had been struck, her face a pale mask of terror as she realized that her biological fiction had finally met its match in the cold truth of a lab report. The physical collapse of their authority was immediate and visceral. Charles slumped back into the pew, his hands trembling as he stared at his mother with eyes that were suddenly wide with a sense of profound betrayal. His soft sob of asking why she had lied about his father was the final confirmation of the cruel nature of Karen's manipulation, a betrayal that had extended even to the son she claimed to protect. Karen finally snapped, her composure disintegrating into a frantic, high-pitched scream as she lunged toward the pulpit to seize the DNA reports. She screamed that everything was a forgery, her voice echoing off the rafters in a way that sounded more like a cornered animal than a grieving widow. Ruth Martinez stepped forward with a quiet, immovable strength, blocking Karen's path with the authority of someone protecting a sacred truth. I stood my ground, my voice calm and projected as I explained the precise forensic process of collecting samples from my father's comb and the discarded soda can. The tactical preparation of the last 48 hours had created a perimeter of truth that Karen could no longer breach, and I watched with a cold satisfaction as her perfect script crumbled under the weight of her own greed. The final blow came when Whitaker produced a single, laminated document, the true last will and testament of Thomas Mitchell, updated just 4 days before his death. My father had written it with a clarity that left no room for legal maneuver, explicitly revoking all previous versions due to the systematic deceit he had discovered. He left the entirety of the Mitchell estate, the house, the construction company, and every personal asset to me, his biological daughter. The document concluded with a sharp finality, stating that he was leaving nothing to Karen or Charles because they had tried to delete his true legacy while he was still breathing. The chapel, which had been a site of my public shaming, was now the site of my total restoration. Karen was left standing in the aisle, bankrupt and humiliated in front of the very community she had tried so hard to impress. I looked at the photograph of my father in my pocket and felt a sense of peace that went deeper than any legal victory. The truth was indeed a force multiplier, and the war for the Mitchell name had ended with the rightful heir back in command of her father's home. The aftermath of the battle was quieter than I expected, a heavy silence settling over St. Mark's Chapel like the dust after a structural collapse. Karen's reaction was instinctive and jagged. She tried to scream about lawsuits and defamation, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. But her threats were no longer the sharp weapons they once were. They had become the hollow screeching of a wind that had lost its direction. Pete Garrison and the men from my father's construction crew did not say a word, but they did not have to. They moved with a synchronized, silent authority, forming a human phalanx between me and the woman who had tried to erase my existence. Pete, with his massive frame and eyes as hard as flint, simply stepped toward her and gestured toward the doors with a cold, final tilt of his head. "It is time for you to go," he said, his voice a low rumble that brooked no argument. I watched as Karen was escorted out of the sanctuary, her heels clicking frantically against the stone, with Charles trailing behind her like a ghost of the man he thought he was. Seeing them walk out into the gray Ohio afternoon, I did not feel a surge of vengeful joy. Instead, I felt a strange, profound lightness, as if a weight I had been carrying for 6 years had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The air in the chapel seemed to clear the moment the doors closed behind them, but the atmosphere remained thick with an awkward, lingering tension. It did not take long for the apologies to start, coming in waves like a tide of late-arriving regret. People who had looked at me with open disgust at the diner, or whispered behind my back at the hardware store, now stood in line to shake my hand or offer a stammering confession. Joe, the man who had worked on my father's crew for a decade, approached me with his head bowed, his hands twisting his cap in a gesture of deep shame. He admitted that Karen had told everyone I was planning to sell the family land to find my biological parents, claiming I looked down on my father's blue-collar life as something beneath my military rank. Mr. Henderson and others confessed to hearing similar poison, that I was cold, heartless, and only interested in the government benefits I supposedly hoarded while my father suffered. I listened to each of them, my expression neutral and my military posture unyielding. I accepted their words, but I kept a calculated distance. In the Army, we know that the fog of war can distort anyone's vision, but I also knew that trust, once broken by such a fundamental lack of faith, requires a different kind of labor to rebuild. The legal fallout for Karen was swift and decisive, a total collapse of the house of cards she had spent years building. She attempted one final desperate maneuver, hiring a low-rent lawyer to file a countersuit, alleging that I had used military pressure to manipulate the final will. However, the case was essentially dead on arrival. With all the Mitchell assets frozen by Whitaker's emergency filings and the undeniable forensic evidence of the DNA results, her legal counsel realized there was no path to victory. Within 48 hours, the suit was dropped. Karen realized she had lost everything: her financial leverage, her standing in the community, and the last shred of my tolerance. Charles, unable to face the biting whispers and the crushing reality of his own mother's deceit, fled the town under the cover of night, moving to live with a distant relative in another state. The dream of wealth built on biological fiction had vanished, leaving Karen alone in a small apartment on the edge of town, a prisoner of her own failed machinations. A week later, I sat across from Lawyer Whitaker in his quiet office, the late afternoon sun stretching in long, golden fingers across the stacks of paperwork. My hand was steady as I signed the final documents to take full control of Mitchell Construction. Whitaker watched me for a moment, his eyes thoughtful as he leaned back in his leather chair. "What are you going to do if she comes back, Nora?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. "What if she shows up at your door one day, asking for a second chance?" I set the pen down and looked out the window at the horizon, where the Ohio fields seemed to go on forever. "I have decided to forgive her," I said, the words feeling solid and true in the quiet room. But Whitaker's eyebrows rose in surprise until I continued. "I forgive her for my own peace of mind, so that I do not have to carry her bitterness in my heart for the rest of my life. But forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. I have instituted a policy of no contact, a boundary made of the same steel my father used in his bridges. She will never step foot in my home. She will never have access to my father's legacy. And she will never be allowed to whisper another lie in my ear. I have spent my life protecting the borders of this nation, and I will protect the borders of my own peace with the same discipline." The boundary was final. I walked out of the office and toward my father's house, knowing that the ghosts of the past were finally at rest, and the future was mine to build. 3 weeks had passed since the final echoes of the legal confrontation died away, leaving a silence that felt heavy, yet strangely clean. I stood at the threshold of my father's workshop, the heavy oak door giving a familiar, low groan as I pushed it open. The air inside was still and cool, thick with the comforting, honest scent of cedar and the sharp, metallic tang of machine oil. These were the smells that had been woven into the very fabric of my childhood, a sensory map of a world that had once been taken from me. The cloying, artificial music Karen used to blast through the house was gone, replaced by the natural rhythm of the wind sighing through the maple trees outside the window. I reached out and ran my fingers over the edge of the old workbench, feeling the grit of sawdust and the meaningful nicks in the wood where my father had labored for 30 years. This place was no longer a prize to be won or a territory under occupation. It was my sanctuary, a quiet base where the soul of a builder still lived in every rusted nail and worn-out blade. My father had spent his entire life constructing homes for other people, and standing here in the silence, I realized he had left me the most vital foundation of all, a sense of belonging that no amount of deceit could ever truly erase. The workshop was a chaotic library of a life spent in service to craft, and as I began to organize the old blueprints and files on his drafting table, I noticed a corner of yellow paper peeking out from a crevice behind a stuck drawer. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it free and saw my name written across the front in his unmistakable, slightly shaky handwriting. The ink was dark, and the envelope felt rough and sturdy under my thumb. It was dated just 5 days before he took his last breath. As I unfolded the letter, I could almost hear his voice in the quiet room. He called me his warrior and his greatest pride. He wrote about the distance that had grown between us, a distance he admitted he did not fully understand, but one that weighed heavily on his heart. He spoke of how he saw my strength every time he looked at my photograph in uniform and how he knew, even when we were miles apart, that I was the only thing in his life that was built to last. Reading those words felt like receiving a final command from a superior officer, an official recognition that despite the static and the lies Karen had tried to plant, our bond had remained unshakable. He knew who I was, and he had trusted that I would eventually find my way back to the truth. I sat down in his old leather swivel chair, the springs groaning in a welcoming, familiar way that seemed to acknowledge my return. I held the letter tightly against my chest, and finally allowed the armor I had worn for years to fall away. For the first time since I received that cold phone call at Fort Bragg, I let myself cry. They were not the tears of a victim, or someone broken by the cruelty of the past. They were the tears of a soldier who had reached the end of a long, grueling deployment and had finally been told she was home. I cried for the years of silence, for the public insults I had endured in that chapel, and for the quiet, hidden resilience my father had shown in his final days to ensure my future was protected. In the deep, resonant silence of the workshop, the pain that had been a constant pressure behind my ribs began to dissolve. It was replaced by a profound peace, a feeling of absolute clarity that I had never experienced during my years in the field. I realized then that the mission was not just about the money or the land. It was about the restoration of a daughter's place in her father's history. The next morning, I stepped out onto the front porch, the weathered wood firm beneath my boots. I held a mug of hot black coffee in my hands, watching the first pale fingers of an Ohio sunrise creep across the horizon, turning the gray fields into a canvas of gold. The air was crisp and tasted of the coming winter, but it felt cleaner than it had in a decade. Mitchell Construction was no longer just a business to be managed. It was a vehicle for a new kind of legacy. I had already started the preliminary paperwork for our first major project under my leadership, a housing community specifically designed for veterans who were struggling to find their footing after returning from service. I wanted to build something that offered them the same sense of security and honor that I had fought so hard to reclaim for myself. I looked out at the long driveway and realized that I had successfully defended the most important outpost of my life. I was no longer an intruder, a foster pet, or a stranger. I was Nora Bird, a daughter who had protected the home front and survived the storm with her dignity intact. I took a long, slow breath of the morning air and felt a genuine smile touch my lips. The duty was done, the perimeter was secure, and a new, brilliant chapter was finally beginning. Nora's journey serves as a profound lesson in the architecture of the human spirit. It reminds us that our inherent worth is never a variable determined by those who are unable or unwilling to see our value. In the quiet, often painful corners of our lives, the most significant structure we will ever build is our own integrity. We often mistake biological ties for an unbreakable bond, but true family is forged in the fires of loyalty, respect, and shared truth. Choosing to establish firm, steel-clad boundaries against toxicity is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate fulfillment of our duty to protect our own peace and honor. I hope this story provided a sense of healing and hope for those of you navigating your own complex family maps. Seeing Nora reclaim her father's legacy and her own voice is a victory for anyone who has ever felt silenced or cast aside. I want to open the floor to you. Have you ever found strength in a chosen family like Ruth and Pete when your own kin fell short? Or have you ever had to stand as a lone soldier to defend your own honor? Please share your experiences and reflections in the comments below. Your stories are the heartbeat of this community. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue exploring these journeys of resilience together.